"Oh, you may speak before His Excellency," said he. "He is one of my friends. You allow me to give you this title," continued the Count in French. "It is necessary to excite this man's confidence." "You can speak before me," said Franz. "I am a friend of the Count's." "Good," returned Peppino. "I am ready to answer any questions your Excellency may address to me. How did the Viscount Albert fall into Luigi's hands?" "Excellency, the Frenchman's carriage passed several times, the one in which was Teresa." "The chief's mistress?" "Yes. The Frenchman threw her a bouquet. Teresa returned it. All this with the consent of the chief, who was in the carriage." "What?" cried Franz. "Was Luigi Vampa in the carriage with the Roman peasants?" "It was he who drove, disguised as the coachman," replied Peppino. "Well?" said the Count. "Well, then, the Frenchman took off his mask. Teresa, with the chief's consent, did the same. The Frenchman asked for a rendezvous. Teresa gave him one. Only, instead of Teresa, it was Beppo who was on the steps of the church of San Giacomo." "What?" exclaimed Franz. "The peasant girl who snatched his mocoletto from him?" "Was a lad of 15, replied Peppino. "But it was no disgrace to your friend to have been deceived. Beppo has taken in plenty of others." "And Beppo led him outside the walls," said the Count. "Exactly so. A carriage was waiting at the end of the Via Macello. Beppo got in, inviting the Frenchman to follow him, and he did not wait to be asked twice. He gallantly offered the right-hand seat to Beppo, and sat by him. Beppo told him he was going to take him to a villa a league from Rome. The Frenchman assured him he would follow him to the end of the earth. The coachman went up the Via di Ripetta and the Porta San Paolo, and when they were 200 yards outside, as the Frenchman became somewhat too forward, Beppo put a brace of pistols to his head, and the coachman pulled up and did the same. At the same time, 4 of the band, who were concealed on the banks of the Almo, surrounded the carriage. The Frenchman made some resistance, and nearly strangled Beppo, but he could not resist 5 armed men, and was forced to yield. They made him get out, walk along the banks of the river, and then brought him to Teresa and Luigi, who were waiting for him in the Catacombs of St. Sebastian. Okay, this is a dun-dun-dun moment for sure. I don't even know where to begin to comment on how Albert has been bamboozled. And maybe blinded to his own desires to go. Well, I mean, granted, everyone is in a masquerade costume, but to I guess he's that whole time he's falling in love with Teresa, who we know as Luigi Vampa's betrothed, his loved, his one true love. From the story that Pastrini told us, it was she who dropped her mask, threw the bouquets, all that stuff. It was only when Albert went to meet this woman, constancy and discretion, remember, she signed her letter, that Teresa was swapped out with Beppo, a 15-year-old boy. Hoo boy, tugging at my collar. It's not super explicit here. I'm going to just assume that Beppo was maybe still in costume and good at what he does. As Peppino says, it's no disgrace to your friend to have been deceived. Beppo has taken in plenty of others. This seems to be a modus operandi of Beppo and Vampa and his band of bandits. I would assume, unless Beppo was wearing a mask, that Albert wouldn't have been taken in by a 15-year-old boy at that moment, but who am I to say? I don't want to comment on it, really. The only other thing, I mean, Peppino's story is pretty straightforward, and we see how people can come to be kidnapped pretty easily around here. But this line I thought was kind of interesting and put me in mind of Nosferatu when Peppino says that Vampa was in the carriage, and Franz is flummoxed by this, and he says, Peppino says, "It was he who drove, disguised as the coachman." Both Nosferatu, Dracula, dress as a coachman to pick up Jonathan Harker as he's coming to make his real estate deals. So it is Carnival, and now I just picture Luigi Vampa dressed as, Max Schreck's version of Nosferatu driving the carriage, even though this takes place long before that existed. Okay, folks, I didn't even get to do my little pew-pew-pews, so prep yourself. Here they come. Pew-pew-pew! Episode 500. How did we get here? I am still just completely gobsmacked by that. And I said I did a little research. It's going to be a little bit longer of an episode to celebrate. I put together some research on the 7 Voyages of Sinbad and also other parts of Tales of 1001 Nights that have affected not only the Count of Monte Cristo, but Dumas in general. Again, a reminder, you can go over to patreon.com/gruntworkpod, and I think still for free until June 10th, you can go and listen to my recordings of the 7 Voyages of Sinbad. If you want some context for what we're about to go into, you can listen to those for free right now. But I wanted to get a better sense of this book that has deeply influenced Dumas. And, you know, I think it's pretty superficial what is apparent in his influence. I mean, i.e., Dante assuming the name of Sinbad the Sailor. That seems, I mean, it is a direct reference, but it's superficial. I think there's more going on as my research has kind of turned up that we can start to pull apart. So let's get into it. I think as we go through some of this stuff, the one thing to keep in mind is, as we've talked about on this show before, in many different ways and forms, the mythic nature of the story and elements that Dumas seems to be playing with. You know, his descriptions of certain landscapes and certain places, his attributions to Greek mythology at times even aren't arbitrary. I think one of the biggest influences he takes from the Tales of 1001 Nights is this kind of mythic quality. It's certainly what Dumas is doing with Dante. I mean, having Dante intentionally make a myth out of himself, but in doing so is Dumas himself is writing it in a mythic kind of way. But let's talk about why and how this came to be. I turned up that there is a French translation of the Arabian Tales of 1001 Nights in the early 1700s that was a publishing sensation across Europe. A translation by, I hope I pronounce this right, Antoine Galland. And it was part of, not entirely, but part of, and maybe even profoundly part of, how Europe's view of and fantasy of the East became known for generations. That kind of exotic Orientalism nature that we've talked about that is kind of cringe-inducing in 2026 is partly why and how that came to be. And Dumas is wrapped up in the fantasy of all of that. He and readers of the time, and you got to imagine that there aren't, you know, a whole lot of fairy tales the way that we know it now. I mean, the Grimm's brothers were working in the 1800s, around the same time as Dumas was just being born. So the Grimm's brothers were publishing their stuff in the early 1800s, just when Dumas was being born. So our understanding in 2026 of, you know, the Disneyfication of fairy tales and fables and all that stuff wasn't a thing back in the day. And so the dabbles into fantasy you got were mostly oral tradition, folklore, you know, stories of like Gilgamesh, Greek mythology, etc. So you see something like Arabian Nights as this tome of imagination, and with nothing to really compare it to, you can see the meteoric impact that would leave on generations to come. So if Dumas is not only coming up as a writer in the wake of that, but also a person, you know, Tales of 1001 Nights in the 1700s, establishing itself as a firm thing that, you know, young people and adults can latch onto, as well as Grimm's fairy tales start coming out in the early 1800s, like that can really shape the imagination of a writer. So then when they come to age, their basis of understanding of what a story can do, particularly when you are an expressive writer from the Romantic school, it makes sense that you're going to draw on these expressionistic stories of imagination and fantastic tales. I found some essays about how Monte Cristo doesn't just incorporate references to Tales of 1001 Nights, but uses it as like a structure beneath the surface of the story. Hopefully I can pronounce these names right as well. God, I'm terrible at this. Julie Anselmini and Sylvia Marsens-Sackley have both written about that mythic structure that Dumas is taking and applying it to what would otherwise be a historical book. When you look at it through that context, it kind of like makes sense. You have one parent being Tales of 1001 Nights, and you have another parent being your average dad trap historical Napoleonic war novel, and the offspring of those two would be the Count of Monte Cristo. That seems to hold true in my mind, at least. But what's more than just, I think, references and using it as structure is how Dumas uses references to Tales of 1001 Nights to tap into that collective imagination that would have been so prevalent at the time that this was being published. So if we think back to some of the references he's made throughout this book, remember when Faria is talking about the Spada treasure, he, refers it to the treasures of the Arabian Nights. And, there's mentions to Ali Baba's cave. Even Franz, a separate character from Dante, references the grotto on Monte Cristo as an Arabian Nights sort of adventure. So it's not even just Dante who is referencing 1001 Nights within this story. Multiple characters are, and that could just be seen as a penchant of Dumas to like constantly cram his own favorite references into it. But I do think it's talking more about a lot of people would have the same reference at that time. What other fantastical scenario would there be to reference for characters like Franz experiencing Dante on the island of Monte Cristo? Let's not forget also that once Franz learns that Dante is assuming the name of Sinbad the Sailor, Franz adopts Aladdin. That was his choice. And you'll see, too, that Dumas uses the 1001 Nights references outside of Monte Cristo. It appears once or twice in The Three Musketeers, mostly as like a cultural shorthand to his readers when he's talking about, mystical natures of things, or huge treasure piles, when you want to just emphasize the incomprehensible nature of something, of glamour, of abundance, these dazzling and dizzying scenes like the Dante's cave or even his hotel at the Hotel de Londres. He often uses the references to 1001 Nights to cap off any of his physical descriptions of, the tapestries and whatnot. It's almost like Dumas saying, like, yeah, there are all these rugs and there's these tapestries and paintings that you haven't seen before, and there are gems and and you know what? It's just like a scene out of 1001 Nights. Like, almost as if he's saying, I can't describe it any more than it being a reference to this thing that is famously incomprehensible. But let's take this one step further and look at it through the lens of the character of Dante, assuming the name of Sinbad the Sailor, which is, honestly, when you step back from the story of Monte Cristo, it's kind of strange to have your character, and one that would become such an iconic character, assume such a specific reference to another work. I mean, it would be like a character today in some sort of fantastical story assuming the name of Dorothy or Toto or something. But, it's not 100% random either. I mean, like, the fact that Dumas uses this, has Dante assume this name, is mirroring the character of Sinbad from the stories. Now, if you do listen along on our Patreon to the stories I've been reading, you'll notice very quickly that, it's not deep on characterization. Sinbad is a pretty one-dimensional character. But even though it's more interested in the things he does rather than the character he is, or why he is, the things that he does are very similar to what Dante does. In those books, Sinbad is constantly leaving home to travel, to go to different islands. He is a survivor of a bunch of different imperilments. It seems like every voyage, to some degree, he is metaphorically destroyed and then reborn. I'm particularly thinking of the fourth voyage when he's buried alive. And through all of his voyages, he is amassing unimaginable wealth, almost by happenstance. Does that sound similar to Dante? And through his different voyages, he becomes transformed into someone completely different. He's, telling a story to a different Sinbad, Sinbad the landsman. So every single voyage that he tells is a flashback of sorts, and the person that's telling the story is a different man from the man that exists within those stories. So you've got that structure, but then the details as well are pretty glaring. Sinbad constantly is in different types of caves, different islands. He's always finding different kinds of treasure. He's often imprisoned. He has near-death experiences. And maybe that might be a little overly general, but I think in discussing the influence that these stories had on Dumas, like, that didn't come from nowhere. I think that is what, there's this adage in writing that you write the story you want to read. You make the movie you want to see. And so I think it's easy enough to say that Dumas, being influenced by these things throughout his life, is gravitating toward those being the things that he wants to put into his own stories when he writes them. And then I'm going to end with this note, something I found interesting but completely acknowledge that A, I don't think we've read enough of the story to really understand yet, but B, I'm also not the expert enough to comment on it more deeply, but there's this idea that is bubbling kind of under the surface here, where by sheer will alone, I feel like Dante is trying to force this kind of mystic, enigmatic nature on his disguises, retreating, never being known, disappearing to unknown lands, having unknown wealth. Where does it come from? Where does it go, etc., etc. But when you peel that back, you're like, well, he's not magical. We know he just came across a bunch of treasure buried on an island. That magic suddenly is kind of undercut by a reality that the mysticism is really just, money, and money can buy information. Money can buy time so that you can travel, learn things, meet new people, get a deeper understanding of psychology. You're exposing yourself to more things, and therefore you're going to have, more logistics to figure out. By meeting more people, you are able to better understand, as I said, their psychology, but lead that into performance and your disguises of things. He's tapping into global networks, and that is very much not mythic at all. That's the opposite of myth. That's modernity. And that, to me, feels like an interesting deviation away from the Tale of 1001 Nights, which is firmly rooted in magic and mysticism. And maybe that, I don't know if that would be the Auguste Mackay influence on this story or not, but we're talking about history here and things like capitalism and global trade and, empires, things that are almost too big for your average person to understand. But if you have wealth and you're exposed to the inner workings of all of those things, it could seem like you are harnessing magic. So as I said, I don't feel like we've read enough of the story to fully understand that part of this yet. But I think there's enough here to kind of acknowledge that, oh, yeah, Dante, if not Dumas himself, is trying to razzle-dazzle us with some magic. But in reality, there is something much more concrete going on. Okay, that wraps up what I've got for today. Our 500th episode. Pew, 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 pew. Meow, meow, meow. But that doesn't mean we're taking a break. Join me here tomorrow with a little bit more of Book 37, and we'll see if we can rescue Albert. All right. Until tomorrow. Okay, goodbye.